said about being generally disgruntled with the state of things and going out and doing a protest vote. You can't have the Liberal Democrats as a protest vote anymore because they've gone over to the Conservatives. Nobody's heard of the Greens because of this business of press ownership and all the little conveniences that go with that. And also there was the story just before the by-elections of these fostered East European children who had supposedly been taken away from their foster parents just because they were UKIP voters or members of UKIP, which of course later turned out not to be altogether true. But that's what the source of all the publicity was just before the by-elections, and maybe they benefited a little bit from that.
Or do you think they've benefited from the collapse of the BNP? Now there's a controversial question.
Well, that's possible, but it's very hard to tell because what you get in the papers is are the proles going Nazi? Are we all getting more and more right wing? And that's from the ones who aren't asking, are we already not right wing enough?
Yeah, Peter, maybe what do you think about that?
Well, there was an interesting piece of research that was done in the University of Nottingham. I think Matt Godwin, who's one of the best people on the far right in Britain and Europe at the moment. He's a young political scientist, and him and some other researchers did some work on UKIP voters, looking at UKIP voters and Conservative voters and kind of the similarities and differences in them. And one of the most striking things was UKIP voters, how important immigration was to them. I think the finding was something like 49% of UKIP voters had immigration as the most important political issue, compared to something like 20% of Tory voters. They were immigration and race were far higher in terms of what motivated them politically than Conservative voters and far more so than Labour and Lib Dem and Green voters. So I think that is quite an interesting, if whether or not they're the forebearers of the BNP is probably neither here nor there. The BNP never had enough voters to finish second in elections and things like that, but they are almost certainly tapping into some issues that might have motivated the furthest reaches of the BNP. But I guess before you had the BNP and the Conservative Party, and maybe UKIP are occupying a space between the two. And there was an interesting article by Alex Massey on the Spectator blog today about how UKIP is a libertarian party. I don't know if any of you kind of caught up on that.
Yeah, no, it was a good piece. He had the wonderful line that he didn't know that John Bull rode a unicorn, which made me cackle.
And I thought there's something in that as well about the kind of the rhetoric of freedom and whatnot, and that they do employ. And it's hard not to see that the issues of at least immigration, if not overtly of race, are motivating UKIP voters, and I do think that's quite a salient point.
I mean, in defence, here's an uncharacteristic move. In defence of UKIP as a proposition, and one thing that strikes me quite clearly about the kind of discussion that's had about UKIP in the UK political context is the condescension towards UKIP is astonishing. And as a Scottish nationalist and as someone who is comfortable with an idea of a history of condescension towards your political movement, I find that it's not that I find any solidarity in meaningful political terms with Nigel Farage and his Englishman in the pub's common sense, which I find to be one of the most dismal manifestations of his politics. But again, it's just really striking how this idea that, if you vote out with the ambit of the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, and the Liberals perhaps are out with the ambit now, then somehow you must be off your chump. And I think that kind of idea of we're talking about groupthink a lot already thus far, but this idea that you have to go for the mainstream in the British state, and if you don't do that, you're just loopy, is I think something which Scottish nationalists will find quite familiar and quite unattractive actually, and maybe have a little sympathy for the likes of Nigel Farage and his pals. I don't know if that's something that resonates with anybody else.
I would have a certain amount, yes. I think there's elements of if you look, if they win 11% of the vote, potentially, if they win 11% of the vote at the next election or 10 or whatever it is, and ended up with no MPs, and there is a sense that, well, obviously that's a first past the post system, but yes, there's a certain condescension that seems to slip into all conversations about what so-called fringe parties, and I think that is unhelpful because it kind of, and because the Liberals are now seen as a spent force. Really, if you're not going to vote for the Conservatives or Labour, you're somehow completely batshit, and I think that's That is unhealthy.
That's just to draw there on a point that Peter made, and maybe I'll ask Michael about this, is the context with the Green Party. Now, the Green Party has a member of Parliament, the English Green Party, that is, because there are different parties in Scotland. But if you look at their performance, the performance of the Green Party in some of these recent elections has been quite poor, actually. In terms of like the police commissioner elections, they were nowhere. And in Scotland,
nobody was anywhere in the police commissioner elections. Nobody was anywhere at all.
That's a fair point. The man in his dog was about the only person. Personally, I voted for Inspector Morse, so I was very upset not to see winning in the Thames Valley. He was defeated by a roomy-eyed conservative ex-army officer who is just my idea of what a really great politician looks like.
So was Inspector Morse a kind of joke candidate?
Oh no, I just scribbled it in the bottom. It's sort of I assumed that would have counted for the purpose.
It was a coded response, was it?
Precisely.
No, I remember one time, you get those joke candidates at the general election. My favourite of all time, it was a guy who stood against John Major in his seat called Baron Buckethead. And,
No, Lord Buckethead of Buckethead.
No, but like,
Crossbench here. Yeah.
So it's election night, and John Major's standing there, and he's going to win the election in '92, and there's just this guy standing there next to him with a bucket on his head. It's just fantastic.
Made him feel at home, a sort of neo-feudalism in the best expression. I think that's the contemporary Britain standing proud and confident with a bucket on his head. Okay, well maybe we'll just nip that wee discussion in the bud there about third parties or fringe parties and how they're represented and thought about in Britain, and maybe move on to a different perspective on Britain. Michael, you noticed another story this week which touches on the very prevalent theme of independence in the world and Britain's role in the world if Scotland becomes independent. Do you want to have a wee chat about that?
It's a theme that comes up occasionally. It's a story that comes up, and I've seen people deny that it's important, and I've seen people say that it is a major concern. But one thing I think about the independence debate in general is that we tend to focus on, what will happen to Scotland? What would Scotland do in this situation and in that situation? But in polls in England, they've quite consistently shown that the people of England are not averse to the idea of Scottish independence. You tend to get quite a reasonable reaction. If you speak to people, it's, well, if they want it, I'm not quite sure why, but if they want it, then good luck to them. You tend to get that. So why is the British state so dead set against it? And this is a part of the debate I don't think we have enough. It's not talked about enough. And I did some digging, and I found this quote. I'd quite like to read it out. This was from Jack Straw.
Please do.
And this was in a speech that he made long before the independence referendum came up, when he was still a minister. And I'm just going to read this. So, historically, England called the shots to achieve a union because the union was seen as a way, among other things, of amplifying England's power worldwide. A broken up United Kingdom would not be in the interest of Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, but especially not England. Our referring to England there, our voting power in the European Union would diminish. We'd slip down the world's GDP tables. Our case for staying in the G8 would diminish, and there could easily be an assault on our permanent seat in the UN. Now, this is part of it. I don't think this is the only reason why the British state is against it. I think it might be part of it, along with the other considerations about oil. And to go back to Robin McAlpine, why not bring up Braveheart? He said, maybe England wants to be able to be seen to be able to control what it considers its own island. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll ask, as our designated Sassenach for the afternoon, Philip, what do you think about that?
Well, yes. I mean, where would we be if we couldn't abstain on the Palestinians every time the issue came up? I mean, I dread to think. But you can hear that speech that Michael just quoted, and you can substitute Russia for England and Georgia for Scotland, or Kazakhstan, or whatever you like, and you can imagine Brezhnev reading it out at the party conference. It's the old imperial perspective. It's this hangover that we've never really quite got over. I really think it's about time we did, but we still. So somebody said a Foreign Office report, a report by civil servants to the Foreign Secretary, said quite recently that the British state is always hearing about how everything's changing. China's on the rise and America's on the decline and India's on the rise and Nigeria's coming up behind. Yet we still act as if nothing's changed and it's still 1945, or in David Cameron's case, as if it's 1745.
No, I was going to ask Peter, because Peter is, as we were just hearing, an Irishman and has perhaps a slightly different perspective on this sort of imperial British perspective. That may be an inflammatory observation. But Peter, does that sort of, I know you live in Edinburgh, but does those sort of themes strike you about the fear of loss of this kind of British imperial history, which still pays its dividend in terms of representation in the, as it's rather pompously put, in the councils of the world?
Yes, I do, and I think Jack Straw's comment is, I think it really is just a kind of an honest assessment in a way. It's quite pompous in its style and quite highfalutin, but it is really just a reasonably honest assessment of some of the fears of why the British state might fear Scottish independence in terms of things like the UN Security Council and its place at the top table, which, let's be honest, it's kind of pushing its seat away as we speak and kind of shuntering off to the back. But there is that kind of element that I think Jack Straw, in a way, was reasonably prescient in that. And although I mightn't fully agree with what he's saying, I do think there is that element to it. And I think Ireland is a different context. Even Northern Ireland is a different context. If Northern Ireland was to want to go, well, probably not go it alone. That's a very long and convoluted story that went on for half of the last century. But I think, say, for example, the kind of location of Northern Ireland in relation to Britain and the rest of the United Kingdom, I think, is seen as less pivotal than Scotland. I think there is that element of wanting to control your own backyard, but also more than that, I think the UK without Scotland and even from their seat in Westminster, it doesn't look quite as grand anymore. And I do think there is that element to it. And there's a conscious and an unconscious level. And I do think there's reasons why Westminster would oppose Scottish independence that are quite pragmatic and are based on these sort of considerations like seats at UN tables and whatnot. But I think it's within many politicians' minds, there is a kind of an unspoken or almost an unspeakable kind of British nationalism. That's this unity that they feel must be preserved above all else.
I'll say, well, the thing that came up this week by someone called Professor Richard Whitman, who was a professor of politics, and he said basically the same thing as Straw, but with an addition, which was simply the rump UK would cease to be one of the EU's big three with a population smaller than Italy. Oh no! It's just kind of struck me as a bizarre thing to say. Oh no, our population will be smaller than Italy. Throwing out random stuff. And military capabilities subordinate to those of France.
That's a great. That's to Wellington to do late service at Quatre Bras. No, this just raises an interesting topic though, which came up in a conversation that I had with somebody. And one of the themes that has run through this discussion thus far, I think, is a confidence in the diagnosis that Britain is still haunted by these imperial ghosts. In terms of its imagination, its self-conception, that it still sees itself, although it's disavowed, its sovereignty over the world, although the supply chains and the frigates no longer scud along the coasts of India and of Africa, there's still a strong sense that people identify with this in a way which is actually quite strange. And what somebody said to me, well, if Scotland becomes independent, then it would be really good for England, because England would be encouraged thereby to exercise these sort of imperial Britannic ghosts and send them back for whence they came and maybe reimagine themselves as a different kind of nation.
I think that's definitely best case scenario.
I think it's probably the best case scenario, but is it a convincing one? And to counterpoint to that, and what I suggested to them was the main adherents now, in my experience anyway, of a British nationalist ideology are the English. They don't want to talk about being English. They don't want to talk about Englishness. They want to talk about these sort of British history. And therefore, why should Scotland leaving Britain affect that? Because largely Scotland's presence in Britain isn't stopping the English articulating their sense of identity in terms of Britishness, which maybe has good aspects and bad aspects, and I have no problem admitting that as a kind of civic aspect and a much more problematic historical aspect. But actually, I think there are reasons to be quite cynical and pessimistic about the kind of dissolution of this British imperial history in terms of its active work in contemporary English politics. I suppose at that point I should probably ask Philip what he thinks about that.
Well, I was just thinking that it seems to me that we in England are very, very ignorant. I mean, I suspect most imperial states are. The people of most imperial states are. What I've seen, I think this came up in a previous podcast, but from what I've seen, all the unionist arguments that you hear, certainly in England, revolve around this, patriotic drivel, this